In the remote valley of the Colorado Rockies, Miriam Caldwell faces the harshest winter of her life. Pregnant and widowed, she struggles to keep her 2 children alive in a half-frozen cabin, her husband lost to a mining accident the previous spring. With no family and no help coming, Miri has learned to chop wood with frozen hands, trap what little game remains, and teach her children that faith endures even when hope seems lost. Then her eldest daughter discovers something in the snow-covered woods that will change everything. A man lies dying, blood seeping through his coat, his breathing shallow in the bitter cold. This stranger is Jesse Maddox, a gunslinger carrying secrets darker than the winter nights. Miri's compassion compels her to drag him inside, to nurse him through fever and delirium, never knowing that saving this broken man's life will either destroy her family or give them the protector they desperately need. But what deadly past is Jesse running from, and will it follow him to their door? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of another bitter night. Miriam Caldwell pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and stirred the thin stew bubbling over the fire. The rabbit she'd managed to trap yesterday would have to stretch into tomorrow, maybe the day after, if she was careful with the portions. "Mama, I'm still hungry," Samuel whispered from his place beside the hearth, his 5-year-old frame lost in Thomas's old coat that she'd cut down to fit him. His eyes, so much like his father's, held that hollow look that had become too familiar since the snows began in earnest. "I know, sweetheart," Miri murmured, ladling another small portion into his wooden bowl. "But we need to make it last." Emma, 8 years old and far too wise for her years, sat cross-legged on the floor, mending one of Samuel's torn shirts. Her nimble fingers worked the needle with a precision that broke Miri's heart. No child should have to learn such skills so young. Yet here they were, each carrying burdens that would challenge grown men. The cabin felt smaller each day, though Miri knew it was the same 16 by 20 feet Thomas had built with his own hands 3 summers ago. Back then, it had seemed spacious enough for their growing family, with plans for additions when the mine started producing better. Thomas had been so certain that the silver vein ran deeper than anyone suspected, so sure that by Christmas they'd have enough to buy proper glass windows instead of the oiled paper that now rattled with every gust. Miri's hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly, where Thomas's final gift grew beneath layers of patched wool and faded cotton. 6 months along now, and she still caught herself setting a 4th bowl at supper, still listened for his heavy boots on the porch after long days in the mine shaft. The silence where his laughter used to fill the evenings felt heavier than the Colorado snow that buried their world deeper each day. Thomas's mining tools still hung on the wall where he'd left them that last morning: pickaxe, shovel, and the small hand drill he'd been so proud of. Miri couldn't bring herself to sell them, though Lord knew they needed every penny. Those tools represented more than equipment. They were the dreams of a man who'd believed hard work and determination could carve prosperity from solid rock. They were the last tangible proof that Thomas Caldwell had lived, had loved, had planned for a future that would never come. "Tell us about Papa's silver again," Emma said softly, never looking up from her mending. It had become their nightly ritual, a way to keep Thomas's memory warm when the cabin grew cold and their bellies empty. Miri settled into the chair Thomas had crafted from pine logs, her movements careful and deliberate. The baby kicked against her ribs as if sensing the story to come. "Your papa used to say that silver was like hope buried in the mountain," she began, her voice taking on the gentle cadence that could still soothe her children's fears. "You couldn't see it at first, couldn't touch it or hold it, but if you kept digging, kept believing, eventually you'd strike something that would shine so bright it would light up the whole world." Samuel curled up closer to the fire, his bowl empty but his attention full. "Did Papa find his silver, Mama?" Miri's throat tightened. Thomas had found something in that mine shaft, found it and died for it when the supports gave way and 1,000 tons of rock claimed him in an instant. The mining company had sent their regrets and a small sum that barely covered the burial. No silver, they'd said. Just another dry hole in a mountain full of disappointments. Papa found something better than silver, she said finally. He found us. He found love and laughter and the kind of riches that don't tarnish or wear away. Emma nodded solemnly, old enough to understand the careful way adults talked around grief. Samuel's eyes had grown heavy, and Miri could see him fighting sleep despite the hunger that gnawed at all of them. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the oiled paper windows and sending drafts through every crack in the walls. Miri rose and added another log to the fire, though their woodpile grew smaller each day. Tomorrow, she'd have to venture out again with Thomas's axe, chop what deadfall she could find, and pray the weather held long enough to gather enough fuel to see them through another week. The irony wasn't lost on her. Thomas had spent months cutting and stacking cord after cord of seasoned oak and pine, but the isolation that had once seemed like peaceful solitude now felt like a trap. No neighbors within miles, no town closer than a 2-day ride through mountain passes that were now impassable with snow. She'd learned to set snares for rabbits and ptarmigan, learned to read the sky for weather changes, learned to make soap. From ashes and animal fat, every day brought new lessons in survival, each one paid for with calloused hands and an aching back. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she wondered if she was strong enough to see them through until spring. The baby would come in 3 months, maybe less, and then she'd have 3 mouths to feed with winter still holding the valley in its grip. The sound of Emma's needle-puncturing fabric provided a steady rhythm against the wind's howling. Her daughter had inherited Thomas's steady hands and quiet determination, tackling each repair with the same methodical patience her father had shown when fixing tools or mending harness. Samuel, meanwhile, had his father's optimism, still believing in tomorrow despite the evidence of their empty larder and dwindling supplies. "Mama," Emma said suddenly, her voice carrying an odd note. "What's that noise?" Miri froze, her hand halfway to the poker beside the fireplace. Outside the wind, beyond the creaking of the cabin's timbers, she could hear something else, a low moaning that rose and fell with human rhythm. "Stay here," she whispered, moving to the window and peering through a gap in the oiled paper. The moonlight on snow created a ghostly landscape of silver and shadow, beautiful and terrible in its desolation. At first she saw nothing, but then the sound came again, closer now, and her blood turned cold. Someone was out there in the storm, someone in trouble. Every instinct screamed at her to bar the door to protect her children from whatever danger might be approaching their sanctuary. But another voice, quieter but no less insistent, reminded her of the values Thomas had lived by, that no soul should be left to die in the cold. That compassion was what separated civilization from the wilderness. "Emma, take Samuel to the back room," she said quietly, never taking her eyes from the window. "Stay there until I tell you it's safe." "But Mama." "Now, Emma." Her daughter's footsteps were quick and light as she guided her sleepy brother to the small room where they all slept. Miri waited until she heard the door close, then wrapped Thomas's old coat around her shoulders and stepped out into the night. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water. The snow crunched under her boots. As she followed the sound, and there, not 20 yards from her door, she found him. A man lay crumpled against the base of a pine tree, his dark coat stark against the white snow. Blood had pooled beneath him, already freezing in the bitter air, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that sent small puffs of vapor into the night. His hat had fallen away, revealing hair the color of prairie grass and a face that might have been handsome if it weren't grey with cold and pain. For a moment, Miri hesitated. This stranger could be anyone, outlaw, drifter, or worse. Bringing him into her home meant risking her children's safety, meant sharing their meager supplies with someone who might repay her kindness with violence. But as she watched his chest rise and fall with obvious effort, she thought of Thomas's voice. "We're only as strong as our compassion, Miri. Take that away, and we're just animals pretending to be human." She knelt beside the stranger, checking for weapons with hands that shook from cold and fear. A gun belt hung loose around his waist, the holster empty, and she spotted the Colt revolver half buried in snow a few feet away. Whatever had happened to him, he'd been in a fight and lost badly. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, but got no response beyond another shallow breath. It took all her strength to get him upright, half carrying and half dragging him through the snow to her door. He was tall and lean but solid, and by the time she got him inside, Miri was breathing hard, and her back ached from the effort. She managed to get him onto the braided rug near the fire, where the warmth might have a chance to reach him. Emma peered around the doorframe, her eyes wide with curiosity and concern. "Who is he, Mama?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but he needs our help." The stranger's coat was soaked with blood from a wound high on his left shoulder, and his skin felt cold as winter stone. Miri sent Emma for clean rags and water while she worked. To get his wet clothes off, trying not to think about how this act of mercy might doom them all. She'd saved his life by bringing him in from the storm, but she had no way of knowing what kind of man she'd invited into her home. As she cleaned and bandaged his wound by firelight, Miri found herself studying his face. Even unconscious and pale with blood loss, there was something about him that suggested strength, maybe even gentleness. His hands, when she examined them for other injuries, were calloused from hard work but well kept, not the hands of a man who lived by violence alone. Still, she made sure Thomas's rifle stayed within reach as she settled in to watch over her unexpected patient through the long, cold night. 3 days passed before the stranger opened his eyes. 3 days of Miri spooning broth between his lips, changing blood-soaked bandages, and wondering if she'd made the worst mistake of her life. The fever had taken him hard on the second night, and she'd sat beside him with cool cloths, listening to him mutter words in his delirium, names she didn't recognize, apologies to people who weren't there, and once clearly, "I won't do it, find someone else." When his eyes finally opened on the 4th morning, they were the color of winter sky, pale blue and sharp with intelligence. He lay still for a long moment, taking in the cabin's modest interior, the sound of Emma and Samuel whispering by the window, and finally settling his gaze on Miri as she stirred oatmeal over the fire. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from fever and disuse. Miri turned, ladle in hand, and found herself looking into the face of a man who was very much awake and very much aware. The vulnerability of illness had left him, replaced by something more guarded, more dangerous. "You're in my home," she said simply. "I found you dying in the snow 3 nights ago." He tried to sit up, winced, and settled back against the rolled blanket she'd placed under his head. His hand moved instinctively toward where his gun belt would have been, and Miri saw the moment he realized it was gone. "Your weapons are put away safe," she said, "along with anything else that might be a danger to my children." Children. His eyes found Emma and Samuel, who had abandoned their pretense of playing and were staring at him with the frank curiosity of the young. "How many?" "2, and another on the way." Miri's hand moved to her belly, a gesture that had become unconscious over the months. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe concern. "Where's your husband?" "Dead since spring. Mining accident." The stranger absorbed this information with the stillness of a man accustomed to calculating odds and outcomes. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said finally, and there was genuine sympathy in his voice. "And obliged to you for your kindness. Name's Jesse Maddox. Miriam Caldwell." "Miri." She ladled oatmeal into a bowl and approached him carefully. "You were shot." "Yes, ma'am. Recently. 2 days before you found me, I'd reckon." "By whom?" Jesse's pause stretched long enough that Miri knew he was deciding how much truth to tell. "Her. Man I had a disagreement with." "What kind of disagreement?" Another pause. "The kind that ends with one of us bleeding." Miri set the bowl beside him and stepped back. "Mr. Maddox, I've got 2 children depending on me, and another coming in a few months. I can't afford to harbor a man who brings trouble to my door." "I understand that, Mom." "Then you'll understand why I need to know what kind of trouble you're in." Jesse struggled to sit up, accepting the bowl with hands that trembled slightly from weakness. The oatmeal was thin, more water than grain, but he ate it as if it were a feast. "I was riding through, minding my own business, when I came across some men doing things that didn't sit right with me. I spoke up. They took exception." "What kind of things?" "The kind that make decent folks look away and pretend they didn't see." Miri frowned. It was an answer that told her nothing and everything at once. "Are they likely to come looking for you?" "Possible. Here? To my home?" Jesse met her eyes directly. "Ma'am, I surely hope not. But I won't lie to you. Men like that don't forget, and they don't forgive." Emma had crept closer during the conversation, drawn by curiosity and the rare novelty of an adult voice other than her mother's. "Are you a cowboy?" she asked suddenly. Jesse's stern expression softened slightly. "Something like that, miss. Do you have a horse?" "I did. Don't know where she got to after I was shot." "Mama, can we look for his horse?" Samuel piped up from the window. "The snow's too deep, sweetheart," Miri said, though her mind was already working through the implications. A horse meant mobility, meant the possibility of this stranger leaving sooner rather than later. It also meant another mouth to feed if they found the animal alive. "Your young ones," Jesse said carefully, "they ever see men with guns before?" The question sent a chill through Miri that had nothing to do with the drafts seeping through the cabin walls. "Why do you ask?" "Because if trouble does come calling, it'd be best if they knew to stay hidden and quiet." "How much trouble are we on talking about?" Jesse set down his empty bowl and looked at her with those winter blue eyes, the kind that doesn't ask questions first. That afternoon, while Jesse slept fitfully by the fire, Miri found herself going through his belongings with methodical thoroughness. She'd already secured his gun belt in the root cellar, but his coat yielded other secrets, a leather pouch containing more money than she'd seen since Thomas died, a few letters written in a careful hand, and something that made her breath catch in her throat. Tucked into an inner pocket, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a photograph of a woman and 2 children. The woman was pretty in a fragile way, with dark hair and sad eyes. The children, a boy and a girl, looked to be about Emma and Samuel's ages. On the back, someone had written, "Sarah, Michael, and Jenny, forever in my heart." Miri stared at the photograph for a long moment, trying to reconcile the image of a family man with the dangerous stranger recuperating by her fireplace. Men carried photographs of their loved ones for many reasons: memory, guilt, hope, but the way this one was wrapped and hidden suggested it was precious beyond measure. "Mama." Emma appeared at her elbow. "What's that?" "Nothing that concerns us," Miri said quickly, wrapping the photograph again. But Emma had seen it, and Emma forgot very little. "Does the cowboy have children too?" "I don't know, sweetheart." The lady looked sad. Miri tucked the photograph back into Jesse's coat. "Some people carry sadness with them, Emma. It doesn't always mean anything we can fix." That evening, as Jesse grew stronger and more alert, the dynamics in the small cabin shifted. He was respectful, even deferential, but Miri could feel his awareness of everything, where she moved, how the children played, what sounds came from outside. It was the alertness of a man accustomed to danger, and it put her on edge, even as she appreciated his quiet presence. "You mentioned a disagreement," she said, as she cleaned his wound by lamplight. The bleeding had stopped, and the edges were starting to knit together, but infection was still a risk. "Yes, ma'am, but not what it was about." Jesse was quiet while she worked, his jaw tight against what must have been considerable pain. Finally, he said, "Some things are better left buried, Mrs. Caldwell, not when they might dig themselves up and appear at my door." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something in his expression that might have been respect. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" A woman alone with children. Most would have left me in the snow. Most wouldn't. I've had Thomas Caldwell for a husband. He taught me that we're judged by how we treat folks when they can't do anything for us in return. He sounds like a good man. The best. Miri finished bandaging his shoulder and stepped back. Which is why I won't have his memory dishonored by bringing harm to his children. Jesse nodded slowly. I'll be gone as soon as I can travel. Will you, Miri challenged, or will you stay until whatever's chasing you catches up? The question hung in the air between them, and Miri saw Jesse wrestling with something deeper than physical pain. Whatever had brought him to her door, whatever had put that photograph in his pocket and those scars on his hands, it was eating at him from the inside. I never wanted to be the kind of man who brought trouble to innocent folks, he said finally. But you are that kind of man. Seems so. Miri studied his face in the lamplight, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too little sleep, the way his hands remained steady despite whatever pain he was in, the careful way he spoke to her children, gentle but distant, as if he was afraid to let them get too close. Mr. Maddox, she said quietly, I've got a decision to make. I can turn you out come morning, wounded or not, and hope whatever's following you passes by without noticing this place. Or I can let you stay until you're healed, knowing I might be putting my children in danger. What will you decide? Miri was quiet for a long moment, listening to the wind outside and the soft breathing of her children as they slept. I suppose that depends on whether you're the kind of man who'd make a stand if trouble came calling, or the kind who'd run and leave us to face it alone. Jesse's smile was grim, but not without warmth. Ma'am, I've been running for longer than I care to remember, but I'll tell you this. No harm will come to you or your young ones while I'm under your roof. You have my word on that. And after you leave? After I leave, you'll be safer than you are right now. Miri nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed him. Then you can stay until you're strong enough to travel. But Mr. Maddox, Jesse, if men come looking for you, I expect you to be honest about what we're facing. You'll have that, ma'am, and more. As Miri banked the fire for the night, she found herself wondering what more might mean, and whether she was prepared for the answer. A week passed in cautious coexistence. Jesse's strength returned with surprising speed, though he moved carefully and favored his left shoulder. Miri watched him with the wariness of a mother wolf, cataloguing his habits and reactions, searching for signs of the danger he claimed to carry. What she found instead was a man who rose before dawn to tend the fire, who moved through her small cabin with deliberate quiet so as not to wake the children, and who seemed to find genuine pleasure in small domestic tasks. He mended the loose handle on her water bucket without being asked, tightened the hinges on the door that had been sticking since the first hard freeze, and crafted a better poker for the fireplace from a piece of scrap iron Thomas had left behind. You don't have to earn your keep, Miri told him one morning as she watched him carefully measuring flour for breakfast biscuits. His portions were smaller than what she would have served, and she realized he was rationing himself, even as he helped. Prepare the meal. Habit, Jesse said simply. My ma taught me that idle hands are the devil's workshop. Your mother raised you right. She tried. There was something wistful in his voice, the sound of a man looking back across years that had taken him far from whatever lessons he'd learned at his mother's knee. Emma and Samuel had begun to orbit around Jesse like curious planets around a distant sun. They were drawn to his quiet presence, but remained shy, speaking to him in whispers and darting glances. It was Samuel who finally broke the ice, approaching Jesse with a question that had apparently been troubling him for days. Mr. Jesse, the 5-year-old said carefully, do you know how to make things? Jesse looked up from whittling a new handle for Miri's worn-out broom. What kind of things? Fun things. Papa used to make me toys, but... Samuel's voice trailed off, and Miri felt her heart clench at the casual way her son spoke of loss. What kind of toys did your papa make? Horses and soldiers. and once he made Emma a doll that looked just like Mama. Jesse set down his knife and studied the boy's earnest face. Could manage a horse if you've got some wood to spare." Samuel's eyes lit up. "Really, really. But you'll have to help. Can't make a proper horse without the right kind of help." And so began what Miri would later remember as the gentling of Jesse Maddox. She watched from the kitchen as he guided Samuel's small hands in selecting the right piece of pine, showing him how to feel for the grain and envision the shape hidden within the wood. His patience seemed inexhaustible, his instructions gentle, but precise. "See here?" Jesse pointed to a knot in the wood. "That'll be the horse's eye. Always start with the eyes. They tell you everything else about the creature you're making." Emma, not to be outdone by her younger brother, appeared with her own request. "Can you teach me to carve too?" "Carving's not really a girl's work," Jesse said automatically, then caught the sharp look Miri sent his way. "Though I suppose there's no law says a person can't learn useful skills regardless." Emma settled herself beside them with the determination of someone who had learned early that persistence often succeeded where charm failed. "Mama says I'm good with my hands. Your mama's right." Jesse studied Emma's fingers as she traced the outline of Samuel's emerging horse. "You've got surgeon's hands, steady and sure. Bet you could carve something finer than any horse." "Like what?" Jesse considered this seriously. "Flowers, maybe, or birds. Delicate work that requires a touch." Miri found herself smiling as she watched the three of them bent over their work. There was something deeply peaceful about the scene. The quiet scrape of knives on wood, the soft murmur of instruction and encouragement, the way Jesse's face relaxed into something almost boyish when he forgot to maintain his careful distance. But the peace was fragile, broken by moments when Jesse's head would snap up at the sound of wind in the trees or the distant cry of a hunting hawk. His hand would move instinctively toward where his gun should be, and his eyes would grow sharp and distant. In those moments, Miri remembered that beneath the gentle teacher was a man who expected violence to find him. "Bad dreams?" she asked. One morning after a particularly restless night had left Jesse hollow-eyed and tense. "Some. About what happened, the men who shot you." Jesse's hands stilled on the piece of cedar he was shaping into a bird for Emma. "Among other things, it might help to talk about it. Might make it worse too." Miri set down her mending and looked at him directly. "Jesse, I've been watching you for over a week now. You're a man carrying more guilt than any one person ought to bear. Sooner or later that weight's going to break you." "Maybe it should." The quiet despair in his voice caught her off guard. "Why would you say such a thing?" Jesse was quiet for so long that Miri thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because some things a man does can't be undone, Mrs. Caldwell. Some choices leave marks that don't heal. And you think you're beyond redemption. I think redemption's a luxury I can't afford." Miri studied his profile as he worked, noting the tension in his jaw and the careful way he held himself apart, even in their small space. "Thomas used to say that every sunrise was God's way of offering a fresh start. Said a man could be anything he chose to be, long as he was willing to do the work. Your Thomas sounds like he was an optimist." "He was, right up until the mountain fell on him." Miri's voice carried no bitterness, only a kind of weary acceptance. "But that doesn't make him wrong." That afternoon, Jesse's strength had returned enough for him to venture outside the cabin. Miri watched from the window as he made a slow circuit of their small clearing, his eyes constantly moving, cataloguing escape routes and defensive positions, with the unconscious thoroughness of a man whose survival had long depended on such calculations. When he returned, he brought with him an armload of deadfall and a grim expression. "We need to talk," he said quietly, glancing toward where Emma and Samuel played with their carved animals by the fire. Miri followed him outside, pulling Thomas's coat tight against the bitter air. "What is it?" "Someone's been through here. Recent. Tracks, maybe 2 days old. 3 horses coming from the east." Miri's blood chilled. "How recent?" "Since the last snow." They circled the cabin, spent some time watching from the tree line. Jesse pointed toward a stand of pines that offered a clear view of their home. Professional work. They knew what they were doing. Hunting you? Most likely. Why didn't they approach? Jesse's smile was grim. Because I wasn't here to see. They were scouting, gathering information. Next time they come, it won't be to look. Miri felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if responding to her sudden fear. How long do we have? Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how badly they want me and how much they know about this place. And if they come? Jesse met her eyes directly. Then we'll be ready for them. That evening, as Miri tucked her children into bed, she found herself memorizing their faces, the way Emma's hair curled around her ears, the scatter of freckles across Samuel's nose, the trusting way they both looked at her when she kissed them good night. The knowledge that danger was circling their small sanctuary like wolves around a campfire made every moment precious and fragile. "Mama," Emma whispered, as Miri pulled the quilts up to her chin. "Is Mr. Jesse going to stay?" "I don't know." "Sweetheart, I hope he does. He makes you smile more." Miri paused, surprised by her daughter's observation. "Does he?" "Yes. And he's teaching us useful things. Papa would have liked him." From the mouths of babes, Miri thought. Perhaps Emma saw something that adult wisdom had missed, that beneath Jesse's carefully maintained distance was a man capable of building rather than destroying, of nurturing rather than taking. But as she settled by the fire for another night, of watching and waiting, Miri couldn't shake the image of those tracks circling her home like a noose drawing tight. The knowledge of being watched changed everything. Jesse began each day by checking the perimeter, looking for fresh signs while Miri started breakfast. The children sensed the shift in mood without understanding its source, growing quieter and more clingy as the adults around them radiated barely suppressed tension. Jesse threw himself into practical tasks with the urgency of a man preparing for siege. The cabin's roof had several loose shingles that he repaired with meticulous care, sealing every gap that might let in wind or weather. He reinforced the door with additional planking, crafted shutters for the windows, and built a second woodshed closer to the house so they wouldn't have to venture far for fuel. "You're making this place into a fortress," Miri observed one afternoon, as she watched him dig a new root cellar behind the cabin. "Better to have it and not need it," Jesse replied, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cold. His shoulder was healing well, though she could see the careful way he favored it during heavy work. What if they don't come? What if those tracks were just travelers passing through? Jesse leaned on his shovel and looked at her directly. "Mrs. Caldwell, in my experience, when dangerous men take the time to scout a place, they've got intentions beyond mere curiosity." Miri's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby seemed to be growing larger each day. At 7 months, she was reaching the stage where even simple tasks left her breathless and tired. The thought of facing armed men in her condition filled her with a cold dread that no amount of Jesse's preparations could entirely dispel. "There's something else we need to discuss," Jesse said quietly, glancing toward where Emma and Samuel played near the cabin. "If trouble comes, you and the children will need to know what to do. Hide. More than that. You'll need a plan, supplies, and a place to go if the cabin isn't safe." That evening, after the children were asleep, Jesse spread Thomas's old maps on the kitchen table. By lamplight, he traced routes through the mountains, pointing out landmarks and potential shelter. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles. North," he said, his finger following a thin line that represented a deer trail. "Abandoned for years, but the structure's sound. If things go bad here, that's where you'll take the children. 5 miles through snow, with a 5-year-old and—" "While I'm 7 months pregnant," Miri said. "Jesse, I couldn't make half that distance." "You could if you had to. People can do remarkable things when their children's lives depend on it." Miri studied the map, trying to memorize the twisting path he'd outlined. "What about you?" "I'll buy. You time to get away. And then?" Jesse's smile held no warmth. Then I'll handle things the way I know how." The conversation was interrupted by a soft sound from the children's room, Emma calling out in her sleep. Miri rose to check on her daughter, finding the 8-year-old tangled in her quilts and murmuring restlessly. As she smoothed Emma's hair and straightened her covers, Miri became aware of Jesse standing in the doorway, watching. "She looks like you," he said quietly. "She has her father's stubborn streak. That's not such a bad thing. Stubbornness can keep a person alive when nothing else will." Miri tucked the quilts around Emma's shoulders and turned to find Jesse still watching, but his expression had changed. There was something raw and vulnerable in his face, the look of a man seeing something he'd lost and could never reclaim. "Totias, photograph in your coat," Miri said impulsively. "Your family." Jesse's jaw tightened. What happened to them? For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, "My choices happened to them." "Jesse, some conversations are better left for daylight, Mrs. Caldwell," but Miri had seen the pain in his eyes, the way his hands clenched when he spoke of his family. Whatever had happened, whatever choices he'd made, they were eating him, alive from the inside. The next morning brought fresh snow and a discovery that made Jesse's face go hard as winter stone. Miri found him crouched beside the woodshed, studying something in the pristine white powder. "More tracks?" she asked. "Closer this time. Someone came within 50 yards of the cabin last night while we slept." Miri felt her knees go weak. They could have, but they didn't. Still gathering information, still being cautious, but it won't stay that way much longer. That afternoon, as Miri struggled to concentrate on mending while Jesse worked on reinforcing the cabin's defenses, an unexpected sound reached them from outside, the distant whinny of a horse. Jesse was on his feet instantly, moving to the window, with fluid grace despite his healing wound. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "What is it?" "My mare." She found her way home. Through the window, Miri could see a bay horse picking her way carefully through the snow, her saddle askew and her reins trailing. The animal looked thin but alert, her breath steaming in the cold air as she approached the cabin. "Stay inside," Jesse said, but there was joy in his voice for the first time since Miri had known him. She watched from the window as he approached the horse, speaking to her in low, soothing tones. The mare nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder, and Miri saw Jesse's carefully maintained composure crack slightly as he ran his hands over the animal's neck and flanks, checking for injuries. "Is she hurt?" Miri called from the doorway. "Scraped. Up some, but nothing serious. Tough as nails, this one. Aren't you, girl?" The horse's arrival changed the dynamics of their situation in ways both hopeful and troubling. It meant Jesse now had the mobility to leave quickly if necessary, but it also meant he might be more tempted to flee rather than stand and fight. More immediately, it meant another mouth to feed when their supplies were already stretched thin. If reading her thoughts, Jesse approached the cabin leading the mare. "I know what you're thinking," he said, "and you're right to be concerned, but Rosie here might be exactly what we need if things go bad." "How so?" "Fast transport for you and the children if we need to get to that trapper's cabin in a hurry." That evening, as they shared another thin supper, Miri found herself studying Jesse's face in the firelight. The return of his horse had lightened his mood considerably, but she could see him wrestling with something deeper. Several times she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between longing and regret. "Jesse," she said finally, when the children had gone to bed and they sat alone by the dying fire, "can I ask you something? Suppose you can ask. Can't promise I'll answer. Do you ever think about settling down, finding a place to stay instead of always running?" Jesse was quiet for so long that Miri began to think he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Used to think about it all the time. Had plans once, dreams about what a settled life might look like. And now I know better than to dream about things I can't have." Miri reached across the small space between them and touched his hand. It was calloused and scarred, but warm and surprisingly gentle. "What if you're wrong? What if the things you've done don't have to define the man you could become? Jesse looked down at their joined hands, and for a moment his careful defenses slipped entirely. Mrs. Caldwell, Miri, there are some lines a man can't uncross, some debts that can't be paid. Says who? Says experience, says the faces that visit me in my dreams. Miri felt him start to pull away and tightened her grip. Thomas used to have nightmares too, about the mine, about the men who died in cave-ins. He said the only way to honor the dead was to live better, to make choices that would make them proud. And if the dead include your own family? The words hung in the air between them like a physical blow. Miri saw the naked pain in Jesse's eyes, the guilt that had been consuming him from the inside. "Tell me," she said simply. Jesse looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him make a decision that would change everything between them. "Their names were Sarah, Michael, and Jenny," he began quietly. "My wife and children. They died because of who I was, because of enemies I'd made. They died, and I lived, and I've been trying to figure out how to make sense of that ever since." Miri didn't let go of his hand. "How did it happen?" "Fire. Set by men who wanted to hurt me but couldn't find me, so they found them instead." Jesse's voice was steady, but she could see the cost of the words in the tightness around his eyes. "I was away on business, the kind of business that keeps a man from sleeping easy. When I came home, there was nothing left but ashes and graves. I'm sorry. So am I. Sorry enough for 3 lifetimes." Miri squeezed his hand gently. "Is that why you're running? Because you blame yourself?" "I blame myself because it was my fault." "And the men who shot you? Are they connected to what happened to your family?" Jesse nodded slowly. "Part of the same web. The kind of men who think violence solves everything, who don't care who gets hurt as long as they get what they want." "What do they want from you?" "They want me to be the man I used to be. They want me to do work that I swore I'd never do again." Jesse met her eyes directly. "And when I refused, they decided to make an example of me." Miri felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What kind of work?" Jesse was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old shame. "The kind that leaves families like yours without fathers, Miri. The kind that creates widows and orphans." Understanding dawned slowly, and with it came a complex mix of fear and sympathy. "You were a killer, among other things. And now I'm trying to figure out how to be something else." Miri studied his face, seeing past the careful mask to the man underneath. Wounded, guilty, but fundamentally decent in ways that surprised her. "You're good. With my children. Children deserve better than what I've got to offer. Maybe. Or maybe what they deserve is a man who's learned from his mistakes." Jesse pulled his hand free gently. "Miri, I've brought nothing but danger to your door. The smart thing would be for me to leave tomorrow. Draw those men away from here. Is that what you want to do? What I want and what's right aren't necessarily the same thing." Miri looked around the cabin, at the improvements Jesse had made, the toys he'd carved for her children, the quiet peace that had settled over their small home despite the danger circling outside. "Sometimes they are," she said quietly. "Sometimes. What we want is exactly what's right, if we're brave enough to reach for it." Jesse's smile was sad but genuine. "You're a remarkable woman, Miri Caldwell. I'm a practical woman with 2 children and another on the way. I can't afford to be anything else." But as they banked the fire and settled in for another night of watchful sleep, Miri found herself thinking that perhaps she could afford to be something more. Perhaps she could afford to hope. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Emma rose early, as she often did, slipping from her bed to help her mother with breakfast, while Samuel slept on. Miri valued these quiet moments with her eldest daughter, the chance to talk without interruption and to pass along the small wisdom that mothers share with daughters who are growing up too fast. But this morning, as Emma reached for the flour tin on the high shelf, something crinkled in her pocket. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and worn, with printing that made her young brow furrow in concentration. "Mama," she said slowly, What does this word mean? Miri turned from the stove, flour on her hands, and felt her blood turn to ice water. The paper Emma held was a wanted poster, weathered and creased from being folded and refolded, but the image was unmistakable. Jesse's face stared back at her from the crude drawing, younger and harder than the man she'd come to. No, but undeniably the same. Below the image, bold letters spelled out words that made her knees go weak. Wanted for murder, 500 reward, dead or alive. Where did you find this? Miri whispered, taking the poster with hands that trembled. In Mr. Jesse's coat pocket. When I was looking for my carving knife, he said I could borrow it to work on my bird. Emma's voice carried the confusion of a child who had stumbled into adult secrets. Mama, why does it have his picture? Miri sank into a chair, staring at the poster. The charges listed were extensive. Murder, armed robbery, assault on peace officers. The Jesse described in these accusations was a monster, a man who killed for money and showed no mercy to anyone who stood in his way. Yet the man sleeping by their fire had spent hours teaching her children to carve, had repaired their home with gentle hands, had held her own hand while sharing his deepest pain. Emma, she said carefully, I need you to go wake Samuel and take him to the back room. Stay there until I tell you it's safe to come out. But Mama, now Emma, and don't say anything to Mr. Jesse about what you found. Her daughter's eyes were wide with fear and confusion, but she obeyed, slipping away, to rouse her brother with whispered urgency. Miri heard their footsteps retreating, heard the soft click of the bedroom door closing, and only then did she allow herself to fully absorb what she was holding. Jesse Maddox wasn't just a gunslinger on the run. He was a wanted murderer with a price on his head large enough to set a man up for life. The reward mentioned was more money than most folks in these mountains would see in 5 years of hard work. And she had invited him into her home, had let him near her children, had begun to— Morning, Miri? Jesse's voice from behind her made her jump. She spun around to find him standing in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour, his face alert and watchful. His eyes immediately found the poster in her hands, and she saw something die in his expression. I see you found my credentials, he said quietly. Is it true? Her voice came out as a whisper. Jesse moved into the room slowly, his hands visible and empty, approaching her the way one might approach a frightened animal. That depends on what you mean by true. Did you kill those people? Did you rob those banks? Jesse was quiet for a long moment, and Miri could see him weighing his words. Some of it, he said finally. Not all, but some. The admission hit her, like a physical blow. How much is some? The killings were real, the robbery charges. Jesse shrugged. Mostly real. The assault on peace officers was self-defense, but I don't expect a wanted poster to make that distinction. Miri felt sick. You're a murderer. Yes. The simple honesty of his answer was somehow worse than any excuse or justification might have. Ibeen, how many people have you killed? Does the number matter? It matters to me. Jesse looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him making calculations, deciding how much truth she could bear. More than I can sleep easy with. Fewer than they claim on that poster. And the families of those people, the children who lost fathers, the wives who lost husbands, they're part of why I can't sleep at night. Miri stood on unsteady legs, the poster crumpling in her grip. I have to think about my children, Jesse. I have to think about what's best for them. I know, which means you have to leave. Today. Jesse nodded slowly. I understand. Do you? Do you understand that I've been caring for a man who makes his living destroying families like mine? Do you understand that every moment you've been here, you've been putting my children at risk? Miri, don't. She held up a hand, stopping his words. Don't try to explain or justify. Don't tell me about your dead family or your guilt or your attempts to change. Just don't. Jesse stood in the middle of her kitchen, looking more lost than she had ever seen him. What about the men who are hunting me? They know about this place now. Leaving won't make you safer. Maybe not, but staying certainly won't either. The sound of approaching horses froze them both. Jesse's hand moved instinctively toward where his gun should be, while Miri felt her heart begin to race. Through the window, she could see 3 riders emerging from the tree line, moving with the careful precision of men who knew their business. "Too late," Jesse said grimly. "They're here." The riders were still 100 yards away, but closing. Steadily, Miri could see the glint of weapons, the hard faces of men who had come expecting trouble. In the lead rode a tall man with a silver beard, his coat open despite the cold to reveal the badge pinned to his vest. "Sheriff's men?" Miri asked hopefully. Jesse's expression was grim. "Bounty hunters. The badge is probably stolen. What do they want? Me. Dead or alive, according to that poster you're holding." Miri looked at the crumpled paper in her hands, then at Jesse, then toward the room where her children waited in frightened silence. In that moment she faced a choice that would define everything that followed: protect the stranger who had brought danger to her door, or hand him over to save her family. "The root cellar," she said suddenly. "Can you get to it without being seen?" Jesse stared at her. "Miri, what are you doing?" "I'm buying time to think." She moved to the window, watching the approaching riders. "They don't know for certain you're here. If they did, they would have surrounded the place instead of riding up openly. You don't owe me anything." "No, I don't. But I owe my children. A mother who makes decisions based on what's right, not just what's convenient." Jesse looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him struggling with his own conflicting impulses. "The children will stay hidden and quiet, just like you taught them. And if these men decide to search the place, then we'll deal with that when it happens." The riders were 50 yards away now, close enough that Miri could see the hard lines of their faces, the careful way they scanned the cabin and its surroundings. The leader raised his hand, calling a halt just outside easy rifle range. "Mrs. Caldwell," his voice carried clearly across the snow, "we'd like a word with you." Miri felt Jesse's hand on her shoulder, gentle but urgent. "Whatever happens, don't. Let them know the children are here. Men like this, they'll use whatever leverage they can find." "Go," she whispered. "I'll handle this." Jesse hesitated for one more moment, then leaned close and kissed her forehead with surprising tenderness. "Thank you," he said quietly, and then he was gone, slipping out the back door like a shadow. Miri smoothed her hair, straightened her dress, and walked to the front door. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she called out, "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The leader rode closer, stopping his horse just outside the cabin's small porch. Up close, he was older than she had expected, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of a man accustomed to command. The badge on his coat looked genuine, but Jesse's words echoed in her mind. "Name's Marshal Webb," he said politely. "We're tracking a dangerous fugitive, and we have reason to believe he might have passed through this area." "What kind of fugitive?" Webb reached into his coat and produced a copy of the same wanted poster Emma had found. "Man named Jesse Maddox. Killer and thief. Last seen heading into these mountains about 2 weeks ago." Miri followed them through her small cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs as they examined every corner, every shadow that might conceal a man. Behind the closed door of the back room she could hear nothing, but she prayed her children were staying silent, as Jesse had taught them. "Nice little place you have here," Webb commented, running his finger along the mantelpiece where Thomas's photograph sat beside the hand-carved animals Jesse had made for the children. "You and your husband built it yourselves?" "My husband did. Most of the work, I just helped where I could." Miri kept her voice steady, though she felt sick at the casual way Webb handled Thomas's picture. "And where is your husband now?" "Dead since spring. Mining accident." Webb set the photograph down and turned to study her face. "I'm sorry for your loss. Must be hard, a woman alone with children in country like this." "We manage." "I'm sure you do." Webb's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Though I imagine you'd be grateful for any help that came your way. Man willing to chop wood, repair things, maybe help with the heavy work." Miri met his gaze directly. Marshal, if you have something to ask me, I'd appreciate it if you'd ask. It's straight. Fair enough. Webb gestured to his companions, who had finished their examination of the main room and were looking toward the bedroom door. We found tracks around your property, fresh ones. More than one horse, including one that matches the description of Jesse Maddox's mare. I wouldn't know one horse track from another. Maybe not. But you'd know if a stranger had been staying in your home. The moment stretched taut between them. Miri could feel the weight of the decision she'd made, the trust she'd placed in a man who might well be the monster these wanted posters claimed. But she could also feel the memory of Jesse's gentle hands teaching her children to carve. His patient voice explaining how to find the shape hidden in the wood. Marshal Webb, she said carefully, I've told you I haven't seen the man you're looking for. If that's not good enough for you, then I suppose you'll have to decide what to do about it. Webb studied her for a long moment, then nodded to the lean man, who moved toward the bedroom door. We'll just have a quick look at the rest of the... In place, if you don't mind. Those are my children's room, Miri said quickly. They're sick with fever. I'd rather not disturb them if it's all the same to you. Won't take but a minute. The lean man reached for the door handle, and Miri felt her world beginning to crumble. If Emma and Samuel were discovered, if these men realized she'd been lying about having children, the game would be up. Worse, if they decided to use her children as leverage. The door opened quietly, and Miri held her breath. Through the gap, she could see the tumbled blankets on the narrow bed, the small forms huddled beneath quilts pulled up to their chins. Emma's face was flushed as if with fever, and Samuel lay motionless beside her, his breathing deep and regular. Sick, you said? The lean man whispered. For 3 days now. I've been doing what I can, but... Miri let her voice trail off, painting a picture of maternal worry and exhaustion. The man withdrew from the doorway, closing the door softly behind him. Nothing there but a couple of young ones sleeping it off. Webb nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. What about outbuildings, root cellar? Anywhere a man might take shelter? Root cellars behind the cabin. You're welcome to look, though it's mostly empty this time of year. We'll do that. As the 3 men moved toward the back door, Miri felt a new wave of panic. Jesse was out. There somewhere, hidden but not gone. If they found him armed and desperate, the situation could turn violent in an instant, and she would be caught in the middle with her children, depending on her to keep them safe. Through the window, she watched the bounty hunters spread out across her small clearing. Webb examined the root cellar with particular attention, while his companions checked the woodshed and the small barn where Jesse's horse was hidden. She saw the moment when the broad-shouldered man found Rosie, saw him call out to Webb with obvious excitement, "Marshal! Bay mare! Matches the description exactly!" Webb abandoned the root cellar and joined his companion at the barn. Through the open door, Miri could see them examining Jesse's saddle, his gear, the personal belongings that marked this as more than just a stray horse. "He's here," Webb said loudly enough for his voice to carry to the cabin. Or was recently. Spread out and searched the area. He can't have gone far on foot. Miri watched them fan out into the surrounding woods, moving with the practiced efficiency of professional hunters. They knew their business, and they were good at it. Wherever Jesse was hiding, they would find him eventually. She was still watching, when Emma appeared at her elbow, moving silently as a shadow. "Is Mr. Jesse in trouble?" her daughter whispered. "Yes, sweetheart, he is." Because of what was on that paper. Miri looked down at her daughter's earnest face, seeing too much understanding in those young eyes. "Yes. Are we in trouble too?" The question pierced Miri's heart. "I don't know, Emma. I hope not. He's a good man, Mama. I know what that paper..." "It said, but he's good. He made Samuel laugh again after Papa died, and he fixed our roof so the rain doesn't come in." "I know, sweetheart. Are you going to let them take him?" Miri looked out the window again, watching the bounty hunters methodically search every hiding place within 100 yards of the cabin. Soon they would expand their search, and eventually they would find Jesse. When they did, what would happen? Next would depend on choices she hadn't yet made. "Emma," she said quietly, "I want you to go back and stay with Samuel. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, I want you both to stay in that room until I tell you it's safe." "What are you going to do?" "What I have to do." Emma studied her mother's face with the solemn intensity of a child who had learned early that the world was not always a safe place. "Mama, are you scared?" "Yes," Miri admitted, "but being scared doesn't mean we can't do what's right." "What's right?" Miri looked out at the men hunting through her woods, then down at her daughter's trusting face. "I'm still figuring that out." As Emma slipped back to the bedroom, Miri moved to the chest where she kept Thomas's few possessions. Buried beneath his work clothes and personal papers was the rifle he'd bought their first winter in the mountains, a good Winchester that he'd taught her to shoot when bears were raiding their food stores. She'd never pointed it at a human being before, had never imagined she would need to, but as she checked the action and counted the cartridges in the magazine, Miri realized that the woman she'd been before Jesse Maddox arrived was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, someone willing to fight for what she believed was right, regardless of the cost. Through the window, she could see Webb directing his men to expand their search pattern. They were moving systematically, professionally, but they hadn't found Jesse yet. That gave her a small advantage, a brief window of opportunity to act. Miri thought of the carved animals on her mantelpiece, of Jesse's patient voice teaching her children skills their father would have been proud to see them learn. She thought of his gentle hands and haunted eyes, of the way he'd held her hand while sharing his deepest pain. She thought of the wanted poster crumpled on her kitchen table, of the crimes listed there in stark black and white. And she thought of her children, depending on her to make choices that would keep them safe in a world that seemed determined to take away everyone they loved. Outside, one of the bounty hunters called out that he'd found tracks leading toward the creek. Webb's answering shout was sharp with excitement and anticipation. Miri checked the rifle one more time, said a prayer for forgiveness for what she was about to do, and stepped outside to face whatever came next. The rifle felt heavier than Miri. Remembered as she stepped onto her porch, the Winchester's familiar weight somehow foreign in her trembling hands. Across the clearing, she could see Webb and his men closing in on the creek where fresh tracks led through the snow. They moved with the confidence of hunters who had cornered their prey, spreading out to cut off escape routes with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Caldwell," Webb's voice carried across the winter air as he spotted her, "I'd suggest you go back inside. This could get dangerous." Miri didn't move from her position on the porch. "Marshal Webb, I need to tell you something." "Ma'am, this isn't the time. Jesse Maddox is innocent." The words hung in the cold air like a challenge. Webb stopped moving toward the creek and turned to face her fully, his expression shifting from professional focus to sharp attention. "Ma'am, I understand you might have feelings for the man, but he's not a murderer," Miri continued, her voice growing stronger. "At least, not the way you think." Webb began walking back toward the cabin, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Mrs. Caldwell, the man has killed more people than most folks have met. The evidence against him is overwhelming." "What evidence?" "Witnesses, bodies, a trail of violence stretching from here to the Mexican border." Miri felt her resolve wavering, but pressed on. "What if the witnesses were lying? What if someone wanted Jesse to look guilty?" Webb's smile was patient but condescending. "Ma'am, I've been tracking criminals for 20 years. I know the difference between a guilty man and an innocent one." "Do you?" The new voice came from behind Webb, quiet but carrying clearly across the snow. Jesse stepped out from behind the woodshed, his hands empty but visible, moving with the careful precision of a man who knew he was seconds away from violence. "I wouldn't," Jesse said, as Webb's hand tightened on his gun. "Your men are good, but they're not that good. And Mrs. Caldwell has a Winchester pointed at your back." Webb glanced over his shoulder, confirming that Miri indeed had the rifle trained on him, then looked back at Jesse with grudging respect. "Clever, but it doesn't change anything. You're still a wanted man, and I'm still here to collect the bounty." "What if I told you the bounty was based on lies?" I'd say that's what every guilty man claims. Jesse moved closer, still keeping his hands visible. And I'd say you're not really a marshal. Webb's expression didn't change, but Miri caught something. In his eyes, a flicker of surprise or concern. What makes you say that? Real marshals work alone or with deputies. They don't ride with hired guns. Jesse nodded toward Webb's companions, who had abandoned their search and were moving back toward the cabin. Real marshals also don't steal badges from dead lawmen. You're reaching, Maddox. Am I? Jesse's smile held no warmth. Tell me, Marshal Webb, what's the date on that commission you're carrying? When were you sworn in, and by which judge? Webb's hand moved fractionally closer to his weapon. I don't have to justify myself to a killer. No, Jesse agreed. But you might want to justify yourself to her. He nodded toward Miri. Because she's got a right to know who she's really dealing with. Miri felt the weight of both men's attention on her, the sense that whatever happened next would depend on choices she made in the next few seconds. What are you saying, Jesse? I'm saying Marshal Webb isn't who he claims to be, and the wanted poster your daughter found isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Webb's facade finally cracked. Enough talk. Boys, take him. But as his companions reached for their weapons, Jesse held up a hand. Before anyone starts shooting, Mrs. Caldwell, there's something you need to see. He reached slowly into his coat, producing a small leather folder. Catch! He tossed the folder toward the porch where it landed at Miri's feet. Keeping the rifle trained on Webb, she knelt and opened it with one hand. Inside was a badge. Not the crude wanted poster she'd expected, but a genuine sheriff's star, tarnished with age and wear. Below it was a commission bearing official seals and signatures, and below that, a letter written in careful script. Sheriff Jesse Maddox, she read aloud, her voice filled with confusion. Tascosa, Texas, commissioned by Judge William Harrison, October 15th, 1881. That's impossible, Webb snarled. Webby. Maddox is a killer, a thief. Sheriff Maddox was investigating a corruption ring that stretched from Texas to Colorado. Jesse interrupted. A ring that included several prominent businessmen, a few judges, and at least one territorial marshal who was supposed to be above suspicion. Miri looked up from the documents, her mind reeling. You're a lawman? Was. Am. It's complicated. Jesse's attention never left Webb, who was looking increasingly cornered. The corruption investigation got too close to some powerful people. They decided the easiest solution was to frame the investigating officer and have him killed. The wanted posters? Forgeries. Very good ones, but forgeries nonetheless. Jesse's voice carried the weight of old anger. They killed my family to draw me out, then put a price on my head to make sure I'd never be able to surface long enough to prove their guilt. Webb laughed harshly. A pretty story, but you can't prove any of it. Actually, I can. Jesse reached into his coat again, more slowly this time. Mrs. Caldwell, that letter in the folder, would you mind reading it aloud? Miri found the letter with trembling fingers. The paper was expensive, the writing formal and official. To whom it may concern, she began. This letter serves as official notification that Sheriff Jesse Maddox of Tascosa County, Texas, is acting under direct orders from Federal Marshal Samuel Carter in an investigation of territorial corruption. Any attempt to interfere with Sheriff Maddox's duties or to harm him in the execution of those duties will be considered an act of treason against the United States government. Dated 6 months ago, Jesse added, and signed by the territorial governor himself. Webb's face had gone pale. That doesn't prove anything. Documents can be forged, like the wanted posters you've been using. Jesse's smile was sharp as winter wind. Tell me, Webb, or whatever your real name is, who's paying you to hunt me down? Who wants me dead badly enough to hire bounty hunters and forge federal documents? I don't know what you're talking about. Then you won't mind if Mrs. Caldwell rides to the nearest federal marshal's office and has these documents verified? Webb's hand dropped to his gun. Nobody's riding anywhere. There it is, Jesse said quietly. The truth finally comes out. Miri felt the pieces clicking into place in her mind. The too-professional search, the casual way Webb had handled Thomas's belongings, the expensive horses and equipment that seemed beyond a rural marshal's means. You're not here to arrest him. You're here to kill him. Among other things, Webb admitted, his pretense finally abandoned entirely. Though I admit, we weren't expecting to find him playing house with a pregnant widow and her children. The casual cruelty in his voice made Miri's blood run cold. What does that mean? It means you've become a problem, Mrs. Caldwell. You and your children have seen too much, know too much. We can't afford to leave witnesses. Jesse stepped closer, his body coiled for action. Webb, whatever they're paying you, it's not worth what comes next. What comes next is you dying in this snow, along with anyone who might talk about it later. And then what? You report back to your employers that the problem is solved, that Jesse Maddox and the inconvenient witnesses are all dead? Something like that? Jesse nodded slowly. Only problem is, I sent copies of all my evidence to 3 different federal judges before I ever came to these mountains. If I don't check in within the next 2 weeks, they'll start asking questions. Webb's confidence wavered slightly. You're bluffing. Am I? You willing to bet your life on that? More importantly, are you willing to bet the lives of everyone who hired you? The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 3 armed men, and a pregnant woman with a rifle, all of them one wrong move away from violence that would end lives and shatter families. Miri could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could taste the metallic fear that came with the knowledge that whatever happened in the next few minutes would change everything forever. Jesse, she said quietly, what do you need me to do? His answer was calm, measured, and filled with a quiet authority that she was finally beginning to understand had nothing to do with the man the wanted posters claimed him to be. Just keep that rifle steady, Miri, and whatever happens, protect your children. Webb's hand tightened on his gun. This ends now. Yes, Jesse agreed. It does. The tension shattered like ice cracking under weight. Webb's hand flashed toward his gun, but Jesse was already moving, diving sideways, as the first shot rang out across the snow-covered clearing. Miri squeezed the Winchester's trigger, the rifle's boom echoing off the surrounding mountains as Webb's hat flew from his head. "Get down!" Jesse shouted, rolling behind the woodpile as bullets splintered the logs around him. "Miri, get inside!" But Miri was already moving, backing toward the cabin door, while keeping the rifle trained on the chaos erupting in her front yard. Webb's men had scattered, using her outbuildings for cover as they tried to pin down Jesse's position. The neat, controlled manhunt had dissolved into desperate violence, and she was caught in the middle with her children, hiding just yards away. A bullet shattered the window beside her head, sending glass fragments flying. She dropped to her knees, on the porch, using the cabin's walls for protection, while she tried to reload the Winchester with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Emma," she called toward the cabin, "keep Samuel away from the windows." Jesse had found cover behind the woodpile, but it was temporary at best. Webb's men were moving to flank him, using the barn and root cellar to close off his escape routes. Miri could see the tactical situation developing with terrifying clarity. 3 professional killers against 1 wounded lawman, with her family trapped in the crossfire. Another shot rang out, this one from Jesse's position. One of Webb's men cried out and stumbled, clutching his shoulder, but kept moving. Jesse was a good shot, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. "Jesse," Miri called out, "the signal mirror. Use the signal mirror." She had remembered the small mirror Jesse carried in his gear, the one he'd used to check for followers during his recovery. If he could get a message out, if someone saw the flashes and came to investigate. But even as the thought formed, she realized how unlikely rescue was. They were miles from the nearest neighbor, days from any town large enough to have a real sheriff. Whatever happened here would be decided by the people already in her front yard. Webb had taken cover behind a large pine tree, and his voice carried clearly across the clearing. "Give it up, Maddox. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and maybe we'll make it quick." "Counter-offer!" Jesse's reply came from behind the woodpile. "You and your men ride out of here right now, and maybe I won't hang you all for attempted murder." Webb's laughter was harsh and without humor. "You're not in a position to make demands." A new complication struck Miri with the force of a physical blow. Her children were still hidden in the back room. But if the fighting moved inside the cabin, they would be directly in the line of fire. She had to get them out, had to find a way to move them to safety before the violence reached her front door. But first, she had to help Jesse survive the next few minutes. Miri studied the layout of her property with new eyes, looking for tactical advantages the way Jesse might. The root cellar where one of Webb's men had taken cover was well positioned, but it also had a weakness: the wooden door that faced away from Jesse's position. If she could circle around behind the cabin, the plan was desperate and dangerous, but it was the only chance she could see. Staying low, Miri worked her way around the side of the cabin, using the building's bulk to shield her from the gunfire. Her pregnant belly made the movement awkward and exhausting, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. The back of the cabin offered a clear view of the root cellar, where Webb's lean companion crouched with his rifle trained on Jesse's position. He was focused entirely on the woodpile, confident that the greatest threat lay in that direction. Miri raised the Winchester, trying to steady her breathing the way Thomas had taught her during their first winter. The man was perhaps 50 yards away, an easy shot for an experienced marksman, but a challenging one for a pregnant woman who had never aimed at another human being. She squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but not by much. The bullet struck the root cellar door just inches from the man's head, sending splinters flying. He spun around, eyes wide with shock, searching for the source of the unexpected attack. Miri was already working the rifle's action, chambering another round. Her second shot was better, catching the man in the leg and sending him tumbling down the root cellar's stone steps. His rifle clattered away across the frozen ground, out of reach. "Nice shooting!" Jesse's voice carried approval and surprise, in equal measure. But Miri's intervention had also revealed her position. Webb's remaining man, the broad-shouldered one who had been circling toward the barn, now had a clear view of her location. She saw him turn his weapon toward her and threw herself sideways just as his rifle cracked. The bullet tugged at her skirt as she rolled behind a stack of firewood, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She was pinned down now, caught in the open with limited cover and a rifle that needed reloading. "Miri!" Jesse's voice was sharp with concern. "Are you hit?" "No, but I'm trapped." Jesse's answering fire was rapid and precise, forcing Webb's man to duck back behind the barn. But the advantage was temporary. Sooner or later, one of them would make a mistake, and in a gunfight, mistakes were usually fatal. It was then that Miri heard the sound that changed everything. A high, thin wail from inside the cabin. Her baby was coming. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The stress, the fear, the physical exertion of the fighting, it had all combined to trigger the premature labor she'd been dreading. Contractions seized her belly with iron claws, doubling her over behind the firewood pile. "No," she whispered. "Not now, please, not now." But her body had its own agenda, and it wasn't consulting her convenience. Another contraction, stronger than the first, made her gasp with pain and clutch at the rough logs. "Jesse!" she called out, trying to keep the pain from her voice. "I need to get inside." Working on it, Jesse's reply was punctuated by another exchange of gunfire. "Give me 30 seconds." 30 seconds might as well have been 30 years. Miri could feel her body preparing for the birth with frightening urgency, could feel the baby moving lower with each contraction. She had to get inside, had to reach the supplies she'd prepared, had to somehow deliver this child while gunmen fought in her front yard. Another contraction seized her, and this time she couldn't suppress the cry of pain that escaped her lips. The sound carried across the clearing, and she saw Webb's head snap toward her position with predatory interest. "Well, well," Webb called out. "Sounds like we've got ourselves a complication." Jesse's response was a stream of gunfire that forced Webb back behind his tree, but Miri could hear the desperation in the rapid shots. He was running low on ammunition, burning through his remaining bullets to protect her. "Jesse!" she gasped between contractions. "The baby's coming." The fighting stopped, as if someone had thrown a switch. Even in the midst of deadly violence, the announcement of impending birth carried a power that transcended conflict. For a moment, the clearing fell silent, except for the wind in the trees and Miri's labored breathing. Then Webb's voice cut through the stillness, cold and calculating. "Change your plans, boys. Take the woman alive. Dead men don't talk, but a woman with a newborn baby might be willing to negotiate." Miri felt ice water flow through her veins. Webb had just shifted tactics, deciding that a hostage might be more valuable than a corpse. If his men reached her while she was helpless with labor pains, like hell, Jesse's voice carried a new note, not just determination, but something deeper and more dangerous. The protective fury of a man defending his family. The final battle was about to begin, and this time there would be no mercy on either side. Jesse's protective fury transformed him into something Miri had never seen before, not the wounded drifter. She'd nursed back to health, not even the careful lawman whose true identity had been revealed, but something primal and utterly deadly. His movements became fluid and precise as he abandoned the safety of the woodpile, advancing on Webb's position with the methodical determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. Another contraction seized Miri, stronger than the last, and she bit down on her knuckles to keep from crying out. Through tears of pain, she watched Jesse move like a ghost through the snow, using every scrap of cover as he closed the distance to Webb's tree. Webb's remaining man, the broad-shouldered, one behind the barn, tried to get a clear shot at Jesse, but found himself caught in a deadly game of angles and timing. Every time he exposed himself to fire, Jesse was already moving to a new position, always closer, always more dangerous. "Tom," Webb called to his companion, "get around behind him." But Tom was discovering that tactics were easier to plan than execute when your opponent moved with Jesse's deadly expertise. A shot rang out from Jesse's position, and Tom stumbled backward, clutching his arm. "I'm hit, Marshal." Tom's voice carried pain and growing panic. "Son of a bitch got me in the shoulder." Miri tried to time her movements between contractions, working her way closer to the cabin's back door. She had to get inside, had to reach the supplies she'd prepared for the birth. But more importantly, she had to check on Emma and Samuel, who had been silent for far too long. "Emma?" she called softly toward the cabin. "Are you and Samuel all right?" The answer came as a whisper through the broken window. "We're scared, Mama." "I know, sweetheart. Stay down and stay quiet. This will be over soon." She prayed she was telling the truth. Jesse had reached a position where he could see both remaining attackers, and his voice carried clearly across the clearing. "Webb, your man in the root cellar is down. Tom's bleeding and can't shoot straight. Call this off. While you still can, go to hell, Maddox." Webb's response was punctuated by a flurry of shots that splintered the logs around Jesse's position. But his firing was wild, desperate, the shooting of a man who was beginning to realize his tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Another contraction hit Miri like a thunderbolt, this one accompanied by the unmistakable sensation of her water breaking. The baby was coming now, whether the gunfight was over or not. She had minutes at most before she would be completely helpless. "Jesse!" she gasped. "I can't wait much longer." Jesse's answering shot was so close to Webb's position that bark flew from the pine tree. "Hold on, Miri. Almost finished here." But Webb had one more card to play. With the tactical situation collapsing around him, he made the desperate decision to use the only leverage he had left. Abandoning his position behind the tree, he sprinted toward the cabin's front door, betting that Jesse wouldn't risk a shot that might hit Miri or her children. He was wrong. Jesse's rifle cracked once, and Webb stumbled, his left leg folding under him as he crashed into the snow just yards from the cabin's porch. But he wasn't finished. Wounded and desperate, he dragged himself toward the door, his gun still in his hand. "Miri!" Jesse's voice carried urgent warning. "He's coming your way." Miri tried to move, tried to get between Webb and her children, but another contraction doubled her over just as Webb hauled himself onto the porch. Through the haze of pain, she saw him reaching for the door handle, saw the cold calculation in his eyes as he prepared to use her family as human shields. That was when Emma appeared in the doorway. Miri's 8-year-old daughter held something in her small hands, a slingshot that Jesse had carved for her during one of their quiet evenings by the fire. David facing Goliath, a child protecting her family with a child's weapon and a heart full of fierce love. "Stay away from my mama," Emma said, her young voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Webb laughed, a harsh sound filled with pain and contempt. "Get out of my way, little girl, before you get hurt." Emma's answer was the sharp snap of the slingshot's release. The stone she'd chosen was smooth and round, selected from the creek bed with the same care Jesse had taught her to use when carving wood. It struck Webb square in the forehead with a sound like a branch breaking. Webb's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed unconscious on the porch, his gun clattering harmlessly away across the wooden planks. "Emma!" Miri cried, pride and terror warring in her voice. "Get back inside," but her daughter was already moving, scooping up Webb's fallen weapon with hands that shook but held steady. "I got him, Mama," just like David and Goliath in the Bible stories. Jesse appeared at the edge of the porch, moving cautiously but with obvious relief. Tom was down, clutching his wounded shoulder and showing no fight left in him. The man in the root cellar was still unconscious from his fall. The immediate danger was over. "Good shooting," Jesse told Emma with genuine admiration. "Your papa would be proud." Another contraction seized Miri, this one so strong it drove her to her knees. In the snow, the baby was coming now, ready or not, and she was still yards from the cabin. "Jesse," she gasped, "help me inside." "The baby." He was beside her in an instant, strong arms lifting her with surprising gentleness. "I've got you. Emma, run ahead and get clean cloths, and wake your brother. Tell him to boil water on the stove." As Jesse carried her toward the cabin, Miri caught a glimpse of the aftermath scattered across her front yard. 3 men down, her home shot full of holes, snow stained with blood. The peaceful sanctuary she'd tried to build for her children had become a battlefield, but they had survived. Against impossible odds, they had not only survived, but prevailed. Jesse's true identity had been revealed, the corrupt bounty hunters. Defeated, and now another contraction, the strongest yet, reminded her that their trials weren't over. The most dangerous part still lay ahead, and this time the enemy wasn't armed men, but the ancient primal struggle of bringing new life into a world that seemed determined to take it away. "Hold on," Jesse murmured as he carried her through the door. "We're almost there." Miri looked up at his face, this man who had been a stranger, then a patient, then a protector, and finally something more, and saw in his eyes the same fierce determination that had carried them through the gunfight. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "Never," he promised. "Not for anything in this world." Inside the cabin, chaos gave way to purposeful action. Jesse settled Miri on the bed, while Emma and Samuel flew around gathering supplies with the efficiency of children who had learned early that survival sometimes depended on quick thinking and steady hands. "Water's heating," Samuel announced from the kitchen, his 5-year-old voice proud of his contribution to the crisis. "Good boy," Jesse called back, never taking his eyes from Miri as another contraction seized her. "Emma, bring those clean cloths your mama prepared, and that bottle of whiskey your papa kept for medicinal purposes." Miri tried to focus through the waves of pain, tried to remember everything she'd learned from the midwife who had delivered Samuel 5 years ago. But this birth felt different, faster, more urgent, as if the baby was as eager to escape the violence as they all were. "Jesse," she gasped between contractions, "have you ever delivered a baby?" Once, my sister's youngest, when the doc couldn't make it through a blizzard. His hands were gentle but sure as he examined her, and she was grateful for the competence that seemed to extend to every crisis. Different circumstances, but the basics are the same. What about Webb and his men? Tied up and secured. They're not going anywhere. Jesse's voice carried grim satisfaction. Though we'll need to get word to the federal marshals about what happened here. Another contraction, stronger than any before, made conversation impossible. Miri felt her body preparing for the final stage of labor, felt the baby moving lower with each surge of pain. Around her she could hear the quiet sounds of her family working together, Jesse murmuring instructions, Emma following orders with adult seriousness, Samuel tending his pot of boiling water like a tiny soldier at his post. "I can see the head," Jesse said suddenly, wonder creeping into his voice despite the circumstances. "Miri, on the next contraction I need you to push." She bore down with all her strength, feeling the baby move and shift, feeling the ancient rhythm of birth that connected her to every woman who had ever brought life into the world under impossible circumstances. Around her, the sounds of her family provided a chorus of encouragement and love. "That's it," Jesse encouraged. "Perfect. One more push should do it." The final contraction built like a mountain avalanche, overwhelming and irresistible. Miri pushed with everything she had, and suddenly the pressure was gone, replaced by the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby announcing its arrival to the world. "It's a girl," Jesse said softly, holding the tiny, squirming infant with hands that shook slightly from emotion. "A perfect, beautiful girl." Emma appeared at the bedside, her eyes wide with wonder. "She's so small." "She's perfect," Miri whispered, accepting the baby into her arms with a mix of exhaustion and overwhelming joy. The little girl had stopped crying and was looking around with dark eyes that seemed far too alert for someone who had just entered the world. "What will you name her?" Samuel asked from the foot of the bed, stretching up on his toes to get a better look at his new sister. Miri looked down at the tiny face, then up at Jesse, who was watching the scene with an expression of such tender longing that it made her heart ache. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope." Jesse reached into his coat and pulled out something Miri hadn't seen before, a small tin star tarnished with age and wear. His original sheriff's badge, the one he'd carried when he first pinned on the law in a dusty Texas town that seemed a lifetime away. "If you'll permit me," he said formally, "I'd like to pin this on during the final confrontation. It seems fitting that the truth should be visible when we settle this once and for all." "What final confrontation?" Miri asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Webb's not just a bounty hunter, and this isn't just about the price on my head. He's the key to the whole corruption ring I've been investigating. When he wakes up, he's going to have a choice: cooperate with federal authorities or hang for attempted murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy." Jesse pinned the badge to his shirt with ceremony that seemed almost religious in its solemnity. The tin star caught the lamplight, reflecting it back in small, bright flashes that seemed to illuminate the room with something more than mere illumination. "Sheriff Jesse Maddox," he said quietly, as if reclaiming an identity he'd thought lost forever. "At your service, ma'am." Baby Hope made a small sound, not quite a cry, but a soft murmur of contentment as she settled against her mother's chest. Around them, the cabin that had been a refuge, then a battlefield, was slowly transforming into something new. A home where truth had finally conquered lies, where love had proved stronger than violence. Outside, the 3 bound prisoners waited in the snow for justice to arrive. Inside, a family that had been broken was discovering it could be whole again. That sometimes the most unlikely people found each other exactly when they needed each other most. Jesse's badge gleamed in the firelight, a symbol of law and order. Restored, of corruption defeated and truth vindicated. But more than that, it was a symbol of redemption, proof that a man could lose everything and still find his way back to who he was meant to be. "Sheriff Maddox," Miri said softly, testing the words and finding them good. "Just Jesse," he replied. But his smile held a peace she hadn't seen there before. "Always just Jesse when I'm with my family." Spring came early to the Colorado Valley that year, as if the mountains themselves were eager to wash away the memories of violence with snowmelt and new growth. By the time federal marshals arrived to collect Webb and his surviving companions, the worst of winter had broken, and green shoots were beginning to push through the earth around the cabin. Sheriff Jesse Maddox, the title no longer felt strange, on Miri's tongue, stood on the porch, watching the last of the law enforcement contingent disappear down the mountain trail. Webb's testimony, given in exchange for his life, had broken the corruption ring wide open. Judges, territorial officials, and businessmen from Texas to Colorado were facing federal charges. The network that had destroyed Jesse's first family and forced him into exile was finally dismantled. "Hard to believe it's over," Miri said, joining him on the porch, with baby Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. At 6 weeks old, Hope had already proven herself to be a remarkably calm child, as if she'd inherited her mother's practical nature, along with her father's steady temperament. "Not over," Jesse corrected gently. "Just beginning." He was right, of course. The legal proceedings would continue for months, maybe years. Jesse would be called to testify, his evidence examined and re-examined by federal prosecutors determined to see justice done. But the immediate danger had passed, and with it, the need for constant vigilance that had defined their early days together. Emma appeared in the doorway, holding something in her hands with obvious pride. "I finished it," she announced, presenting a carved wooden horse that was remarkably detailed for the work of an 8-year-old girl. Jesse examined the carving with the serious attention he gave to all the children's efforts. "That's fine work. Emma, see how you got the proportions just right? Your papa would be proud." "Are you proud?" Emma asked, and Miri heard the deeper question beneath the words, the need for approval from the man who had become, in all but name, her father. "Very proud," Jesse assured her. "In fact, I think it's good enough to put on the mantelpiece with the others." Emma beamed and ran inside to display her creation alongside the growing collection of carved animals that had become a symbol of their unconventional family's growing artistry and patience. Samuel emerged from the barn, leading Jesse's horse Rosie with the confidence of a boy who had learned responsibility through necessity. At 6 years old, he could already saddle and bridle the mare, could judge her mood and needs with an intuition that impressed even Jesse. "She's ready if you need to ride to town," Samuel reported. "Not today," Jesse said. "Today I'm staying home." Home. The word carried weight now, representing not just a place, but a promise that the running was over, that the man who had arrived half dead in the snow had found something worth staying for. The legal resolution of Jesse's case had been remarkably swift once Webb's testimony reached the federal prosecutors. The wanted posters were officially rescinded, Jesse's commission as a federal investigator was restored, and he was offered a position with the Territorial Marshal Service that would have taken him to Denver with a significant salary and considerable prestige. He had turned it down without hesitation. "The territory's got plenty of marshals," he'd told the federal representative, "but this valley's got none, and these folks deserve someone who'll look after their interests." So Sheriff Jesse Maddox had become the valley's unofficial lawman, mediating disputes between neighbors, investigating the occasional theft of livestock, and generally maintaining the peace in a region that had never known formal law enforcement. It wasn't the career he'd planned, but it was the life he'd chosen. Miri shifted Hope to her other arm and studied Jesse's profile as he watched their children play in the afternoon sunshine. The haunted look had faded from his eyes, replaced by something she could only call contentment. The man who had arrived carrying guilt and pain had learned, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, to accept forgiveness and love. "Jesse," she said quietly, "there's something I want to show you." She led him inside to where a small easel sat near the window, supporting a piece of paper covered with pencil sketches. Jesse studied the drawing with growing wonder. It showed their family as they were now. Miri holding Hope, Emma and Samuel flanking them, and Jesse himself standing behind them with his hand on Emma's shoulder. "You drew this?" he asked. Emma helped with some of the details. "She's got a good eye for faces." Jesse touched the edge of the paper gently, as if afraid it might disappear. "It's beautiful. It's us," Miri said simply. "Our family, all of us." Jesse looked at the drawing for a long moment, then carefully lifted it from the easel. "May I keep this? It's yours. We all are if you want us." Jesse set the drawing down and turned to face her fully. "Miri, I've been thinking about something for weeks now, and I can't seem to find the right words. Try simple ones." Jesse smiled, the expression transforming his face with its warmth. "Marry me." Miri had known the question was coming, had seen it building in his eyes for weeks as they'd settled into the rhythms of family life. But hearing the words still sent a thrill through her that had nothing to do with practical considerations and everything to do with love. "Yes," she said without hesitation. Jesse reached into his pocket and produced a ring carved from mountain stone, obsidian polished to a mirror shine and set with small pieces of silver that caught the light like stars. "I made it myself," he said almost shyly. "It's not much, but it's perfect." Miri held out her left hand, watching as Jesse slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly from emotion. Absolutely perfect. Emma and Samuel had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the quiet intensity of the adult conversation. They stood watching with the solemn attention children reserved for moments they sensed were important. "Does this mean Mr. Jesse is going to be our papa?" Samuel asked. "If you want me to be," Jesse replied seriously. Samuel considered this with 5-year-old gravity. "Will you teach me to shoot when you're older? Will you keep carving animals with us every day? Will you stay even when bad men come?" Jesse knelt down to bring himself to eye level with the boy. "Samuel, I promise you that nothing and no one will ever take me away from this family. You have my word as a lawman and my oath as a man who loves you." Samuel nodded solemnly, then broke into a grin that lit up the room. "Then yes, I want you to be my papa." Emma's acceptance was quieter, but no less meaningful. She approached Jesse. With something in her hands, the family photograph he'd carried, the one that had shown his first wife and children. "I found this when I was cleaning," she said. "Do you want to put it away now?" Jesse took the photograph gently, studying the faces of the family he'd lost. For a moment, Miri worried that the old pain would return, that the memories would pull him back into the guilt and regret that had defined him for so long. Instead, Jesse smiled. "No," he said quietly. "I think we'll keep it on the mantelpiece, right next to our family drawing. They're part of who I am, and that means they're part of who we are." Emma nodded, with the wisdom of a child who understood that love didn't diminish when it was shared, but grew stronger. "They would have liked us, wouldn't they?" "They would have loved you," Jesse assured her, "just like I do." As the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, illuminating the collection of carved animals and family mementos that made their house a home, Miri felt a deep sense of completion. The woman who had struggled alone through the harsh winter with 2 children, and a baby on the way, was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more confident. The man who had arrived half dead and carrying more guilt than any soul should bear had found redemption through love and service. Their story had begun with a dying stranger in the snow and a desperate woman's choice to show compassion despite the risk. It was ending, or rather beginning again, with the family bound not just by law or blood, but by the deeper ties of choice and commitment and love freely given. Outside, spring continued its ancient work of renewal, and inside the cabin, Hope stirred in her mother's arms and opened dark eyes that seemed to hold all the promise of the future stretching out before them.